Okay, so this will be our first edition of the book club. We're doing Marx's German ideology, or German ideology, as some people like to say. um, so I guess we should choose a format. So do you want to just, it's just the two of us right now. So do you want to just switch off reading the paragraphs?
Sure.
Do you want to discuss like after every paragraph or when we're done with a section?
Um, we can do paragraphs, I think. Although I don't mind, we can see what works.
All right. And Varsity's going to join in a minute. So let's just do the prelude or preface for now and he can catch
Yeah,
up. All right,
sure.
so I'll start.
So preface. Yep.
Okay. Hitherto men have constantly made up for themselves false conceptions about themselves, about what they are and what they ought to be. They have arranged their relationships according to their ideas of God, of normal man, etc. The phantoms of their brains have got out of their hands. They, the creators, have bowed down before their creation. Let us liberate them from the chimeras, the ideas, dogmas, imaginary beings under the yoke of which they are pining away. Let us revolt against the rule of thoughts. Let us teach men, says one, to exchange these imaginations for thoughts which correspond to the essence of man. Says the second, to take up a critical attitude to them. Says the third, to knock them out of their heads. And existing reality will collapse.
That definitely sounds very anti-philosophical, at least on the surface. What do you think?
Yeah, I read over the preface before we came here, and I was trying to
Mhm.
think how much of it is anti-philosophy in general, and how much is it specifically against like Hegelian philosophy?
Yes, I do think that's a good point. I think, especially if you were in Germany in the 1840s, just the sheer presence of Hegel would have been everywhere in all departments in education. Um, that is a good point to be raised, for sure. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, I guess I don't really know too much about Hegel per se, although I am faintly aware that at the very start, it says they have arranged their relationships according to the ideas of God. I think um, for Hegel, I believe the closest thing would be the spirit. Hegel did at least appear to be talking a lot about the idea of the spirit and the absolute. And here, I think when Marx is referring to God, I think he's referring to what others would call the absolute, the ground of being, or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, what do you think? Would you agree with that sentiment, or would you?
Yeah, I mean, from what I would say, yes. And knowing what I've seen from his other work, he thinks that, well, I think for him, Hegel's more, yeah, he's tying God in with the absolute. But I think when he says things like, the rule of thought, I think that's really specifically against Hegel.
Hmm, yes,
Like
yes.
he's like,
I guess
the con-
here's a place where I'd like to just chime in a second, just to mention that, like, it's not just against Hegel. I mean, it's also against basically the two strains of Hegelian thought that Marx is going to continue to talk about throughout the book, which is, or at least for the first like part of the book that focuses on, you the the philosophical points of this work, like the young Hegelians and the old Hegelians, right? So that, I mean, I think the rule of thought to me is signification for this type of thing, like this old Hegelian kind of worship of existent category, instantiated. Uh, on the other hand, I want to kind of elucidate more clearly that the young Hegelians are also, again, this like an amateur way, which is something interesting.
Hmm.
Good point. I just want to point out one more thing that we can go to the next paragraph. I like that he includes in there of normal man too, like this idea that there's a like general or normal man that you can ascribe things to,
Mhm.
rather than man conditioned by their specific uh, society or modes of production or whatever.
Yeah. I don't know if this is going to be in this text, but I suppose this might be foreboding to Marx's humanism, his idea of the humanity. Perhaps this could be a reference to it. Maybe it's not. We'll just have to read and see.
Mhm. All right, you want to take the next one?
Sure. These innocent and childlike fancies are the kernel of modern young Hegelian philosophy, which not only is received by the German public with horror and awe, but is announced by our philosophic heroes with a solemn consciousness of its cataclysmic dangerousness and criminal ruthlessness. The first volume of the present publication has the aim of uncloaking these sheep who have taken themselves and are taken for wolves, of showing how their bleating merely imitates in a philosophic form the conceptions of the German middle class, how the boasting of these philosophic commentators only mirrors the wretchedness of the real conditions in Germany. It is the aim it is its aim to debunk and discredit the philosophic struggle with the shadows of reality, which appeals to the dreamy and muddled German nation.
Okay. Um, yeah, I guess that elucidates too what Wandering was adding, like specifically the young Hegelians are in the crosshairs here, and the old
Yep.
Hegelians. Um, I noticing he's also kind of talking about his what is it? The boasting of these philosophic commentators only mirrors the wretchedness of the real conditions. So he's getting into that what they call it,
Mm-hmm.
the immanent critique or whatever already too.
Yep. Yep. And I think from another angle, one can perhaps see how within young Hegelian philosophy, so here he's accusing them of LARPing to be philosophic heroes, right? But essentially having very dangerous um, philosophy. Specifically, he's mentioning the conceptions of the German middle class. I think what he's trying to refer, obviously, he's going to talk about it later on in the work, but I think he's already laying some sort of a groundwork for how the supposed idealism of the Hegelian philosophy, um, at least on the surface, prima facie, seems to be detached from the everyday German person and is sort of a product of fancy of like German middle class. I'm not sure if that's where he's trying to get at. Um,
I think that makes sense to me. Yeah, let's go on. Farsi, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
yes.
Do you want to take the next paragraph?
Sure. Um, Once upon a time, a valiant fellow had the idea that men were drowned in water only because they were possessed with the idea of gravity. If they were to get this notion out of their heads, say by avowing it to be a religious concept, they would be sublimely proof against any danger from water. His whole life long he fought against the illusion of gravity, of whose harmful consequences all statistics brought him new and manifold evidence. This valiant fellow was the type of the new revolutionary philosophers in Germany.
All right. Yeah, that was a good paragraph too. Um,
Mhm.
That reminds me of Tower honestly, because it's like he feels like if you just have the right conception of like your relation to other people or freedom or consciousness, then you're gonna solve all these world problems.
Not so much like the metaphysical stuff. It's the practical implications that follow from taking an idealist conception of history, which is exactly that, which is this idea, well, if we just change people's ideas, everything will be better. I mean, I would argue that's pretty much the state of politics in the US right now.
Yeah, I mean, probably around the world at this point, right? I feel like the internet's contributed to that too.
Yeah. Yep. I definitely agree.
That not Nick guy always jumps in and leaves immediately.
Oh no, Marxism, run away.
I don't know against Marxism though. Also, the event is very clearly labeled German Ideology Book Club. All right, so let's get started. We'll do part A, I think, is what I want to try to get through. If we don't get through all of it, though, that's fine. So I'll do the next one. So we got part one, Feuerbach opposition of the materialist and idealist outlook. And then section A is idealism and materialism. And then we got subsection, the illusions of German ideology. As we hear from German ideologists, Germany has in the last few years gone through an unparalleled revolution. The decomposition of the Hegelian philosophy, which began with Strauss, has developed into a universal ferment into which all the powers of the past are swept. In the general chaos, mighty empires have arisen only to meet with immediate doom. Heroes have emerged momentarily, only to be hurled back into obscurity by bolder and stronger rivals. It was a revolution beside which the French Revolution was child's play. A world struggle beside which the struggles of the Diadochi, successors of Alexander the Great, appeared insignificant. Principles ousted one another, heroes of the mind overthrew each other with unheard of rapidity, and in the years 1842 to 45, more of the past was swept away in Germany than at any other time in 3 centuries. All this is supposed to have taken place in the realm of pure thought. Okay, that's the
I,
classic
th-
line.
I, I think this is just classic attack on idealism. I think here he's obviously referring to how this fervent idealism, this revolution of thought, of the composition, of form, of content, of thought, has. And here he's just describing how supposedly all these Hegelians have gone through so much revolution of thought, especially in like 1842, 1845 that he's describing. Yet, well, I mean, he hasn't described what happens yet, but we'll get to that in a bit. But here he's laying the foundation that at least within the realm of concepts and thoughts and abstractions, it either is the case that a lot of these Hegelians were thinking that all these revolutions were happening, or maybe in a broader sense, German society as a whole was in a period of imagining itself to undergo through some revolutions of thought, of revolutions of, I guess form is the correct term.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Have you guys talked to any Hegelians, like modern ones?
I vaguely know one guy who did a PhD in Hegel, but unfortunately he lives in Germany, and I haven't talked to him
I have a,
that
I have a,
much.
I have a friend who's really into him, and he talks about him just like this passage is describing. It's like Germany went through all this revolution at this time period, and we still are contending with it. And the only reason you would disagree with Hegel is because you don't understand him, because just so much was happening.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, sorry, go on.
can I say something?
Yeah.
Um, so I mean, I don't know if maybe it's obvious, but I think he's talking about the young Hegelians just as much as the old Hegelians here, maybe even more so. Is that clear to everyone?
Yeah, because he called them
Okay.
out a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to pinpoint that, especially because we're recording it too.
Yeah, so when they talk about the decomposition of, can you scroll up just a bit? I just want to make sure I get it. The decomposition of the Hegelian philosophy, which began with Strauss. He's talking about David Strauss, I believe was his name, who wrote a book called Life of Jesus, which kind of sparked this big controversy and kind of, as far as most people are concerned, that's kind of where the schism between the old and the young Hegelians is thought to have first emerged, was with this rather scandalous book by Strauss. But Marx, who only until very recently was himself part of this, band of philosophical uh, misfits, like he's kind of talking about, I mean, this is kind of like his kind of satire of their kind of impression of what they're accomplishing with their present critique of Hegel and their present critique of, you know, religion and all this stuff is basically, to put it in a rather crude and maybe oversimplistic summary, is that Marx thinks that the young Hegelians have accomplished not that much different from what the old Hegelians accomplishing, because we're still caught up in this paradigm of wrestling with Hegel, wrestling with religion.
Do you think for the listeners too, could you just give a little bit of what is the exact schism between the young and old Hegelians? Like, is there like a specific concept?
I think there's a few ways that you can carve it up to make it most simple. The old Hegelians, the old and young Hegelians, some people also call it the right and left Hegelians. Basically, the old Hegelians are going to be conservative, religious, and idealist. The young Hegelians are leftist or radical, material.
You broke up there at the end. We got the younger ones are more materialist, older ones are more religious. No, we can't. Maybe come out and come back in. Okay, try again. Nothing?
There's no sound.
Ah, no. Poor guy.
Hmm.
Um, right. Well, that was good to clarify.
I could make another point. I guess just to, I don't know, fill the air for a little bit. Or it looks like he's back actually. Let's give him a chance.
Okay. Varsity, you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, much better.
Oh, okay. I apologize. Been having a lot of issues with my internet lately. Um, yeah, so that's the schism between the old and the young. And the last thing I was going to say is just like, because the question always comes up is like, well, if they're criticizing Hegel, why do they call themselves young Hegelians? Like, well, because that's kind of how it works, whether you like it or not. Hegel was someone you kind of had to contend with. It wasn't a matter of simply not engaging with him. It was kind of like you're either on his side or you're trying to take his philosophy and do something else with it, which is what the young Hegelians were trying to do. They liked the structure of his philosophical system, is the way I would put it, but they wanted to populate it with their own materialist radical contents, if that makes sense. Which is not easy to do, and that's why so many tried and failed. And that Marx's success with that project is the reason we still talk about Marx rather than Feuerbach or Bauer or any of these other guys today. Or it's a big part of it, maybe not the only part.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Does-
Imperial, you want to take the next one, or do you have another?
Sure. I just maybe want to just summarize. So, right Hegelians are old Hegelians, and they're more religious and idealist, while the young Hegelians or left Hegelians, they're more materialist, if I understood that correctly.
Yeah, the old Hegelians are using Hegel to justify the status quo, basically. You know, they're the
Mhm.
Hegelians that the German, or I guess Prussian academics, they like them. The young Hegelians, they don't like them because they're not playing by the rules, you know?
Okay, I just wanted to clarify.
Mhm.
Okay, I can read the next paragraph then.
Yep.
So, certainly it is an interesting event we are dealing with, the putrescence of absolute spirit. When the last spark of its life had failed, the various components of this caput mortuum began to decompose, entered into new combinations, and formed new substances. The industrialists of philosophy, who till then had lived on the exploitation of the absolute spirit, now seized upon the new combinations. Each with all possible zeal set about retaining his apportioned share. This naturally gave rise to competition, which, to start with, was carried out in moderately staid bourgeois fashion. Later, when the German market was glutted, and the commodity, in spite of all efforts, found no response in the world market, the business was spoiled in the usual German manner by fabricated and fictitious production, deterioration in quality, adulteration of raw materials, falsification of labels, fictitious purchases, bill jobbing, and credit system devoid of any real basis. The competition turned into a bitter struggle, which is now being extolled and interpreted to us as a revolution of world significance, the begetter of the most prodigious results and achievements.
Yeah, that's interesting. Seems like a largely, well, he's trying to draw it into his critique of capital almost, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like associated with bourgeois society.
Mhm.
The market is glutted. It's being exploited. The absolute spirit is exploited in some sense.
Uh-huh. So with the
I think
absolute
it's worth
spirit.
adding. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry. You go first.
Yeah. Between young, this like he basically believes that the young Hegelians are a bourgeois kind of philosophy, and old Hegelians are like actionaries. And this is going to come up in a couple paragraphs and be elucidated a little bit better. But I think that something that is notable about that paragraph there is that it highlights, what about this justification that comes out of like this notion of the man, right? Or the notion, the picture of man that like young Hegelians like Feuerbach and Stirner, they talk about this notion of like the great man of history, not like in the context of great man theory, but in the context of like this concept of man coming into his own, discovering that these idols are false idols, and then creating his own idol of man. And I think that something that both Stirner and Marx kind of criticize is this taking up of the picture of man in that way, as if like these notions that we've come to right now in society in Marx's time, the contemporaneous like bourgeois philosophy, he's going to try and say that these things are basing, being critical of what is called like natural law and like all of these essentialist doctrines, but then establishing on top of this criticism of essentialist doctrines a pseudo essentialist kind of doctrine of capital. And I think that he wants to include like quite a few of the other like I don't know, more contemporary figures that Marx talks with under that umbrella as well. Like I think Stirner also has that criticism, but then we're going to find out that there's other things that Marx parts with Stirner on, and that's going to be the section of some upcoming section later.
Mhm.
All right, insightful.
Yeah.
Okay.
What do you guys think the absolute spirit that Marx is referring to here?
I think that that's
Means.
exactly what we were talking about in reference to the general man of history or whatever, and I think that it's attached to it at the hip for Feuerbach, and that's why Marx is very critical of talking about absolute spirit, of talking about like these kinds of notions of totality. And to be very transparent, I think Hegel's also seeing that as a problem. But I think that there's other ways in which when we're going to read this work, we're going to find out there's other things, not just this kind of point that Marx is going to part from Hegel on. I mean, like, I think generally this work is something that symbolizes like, partially like the break with philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
I
For
wonder
sure.
you maybe to take it less historically and more conceptually, but I guess he's kind of talking about the like cheapening of philosophy in a way too. Like it sounds like philosophy is becoming more of a kind of cheap thing that's just trying to go beyond the last person. It has to like keep inventing ideas in order to like propagate itself into the minds of people in some way.
I think that's
I
right.
think that's good.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I think that's right. I think that's part of the problem Marx sees with like, I mean, a lot of the problems Marx has with the young Hegelians is like they seem to get stuck on these projects that Marx is like kind of ready to mature beyond and move beyond. We see the same thing with his frustration over their obsession with religious critique. He's kind of like, we're done with this. It's time to move on to something else.
Yeah, I was trying to see if there's something we could take away to the modern state of affairs as well, because I feel like there's a sort of cheapening with these concepts nowadays as well. I don't know if it's exactly the same thing, but like kind of like the proliferation of like isms and like
Yes.
these
Yeah.
kind of-
Well, we're definitely seeing a resurgence of like system building as philosophy. Like, I mean, at least on here, I think on like Discord, we've seen a big resurgence. Like everyone has their own unified theory of everything now, and that's unfortunate.
right. Okay. Do you want to read the next one? Varsity?
Me or okay.
If we wish to rate it at its true value, this philosophic charlantry, which awakens even in the breast of the honest German citizen a glow of national pride, if we wish to bring out clearly the pettiness, the parochial narrowness of this whole young Hegelian movement, and in particular the tragicomic contrast between the illusions of these heroes about their achievements and the actual achievements themselves, we must look at the whole spectacle from a standpoint beyond the frontiers of Germany.
I guess the main phrase that stuck out to me was the standpoint beyond the frontiers of Germany.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't live in Germany with Marx, so I can't speak to how, I mean, some may, whether or not this is an accurate assessment that he's making or not. I think it's a common assessment that Marx makes where he kind of ties a lot of the problems he sees in philosophy, like he ties those in with like the distinctive character of German philosophy specifically. Like that's kind of a recurring theme with him.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this as a problem though sometimes. And I, you know,
Yeah.
this may be one thing that turns me off from this kind of philosophy is that why are you able to look beyond it?
I agree. I agree. And that's exactly the criticism that Marx himself levies against the utopian socialists is, well, what exempts you from this process by which we're all blinded, but you're somehow able to see the truth, the beacon of light or whatever. I think that's a valid criticism.
Okay. I'll move on to the next one then if no one else has something to add. German criticism has, right up to its latest efforts, never quitted the realm of philosophy. Far from examining its general philosophic premises, the whole body of its inquiries has actually sprung from the soil of a definite philosophical system, that of Hegel. Not only in their answers, but in their questions, there was a mystification. The dependence of Hegel is the reason why not one of these modern critics has ever attempted a comprehensive criticism of the Hegelian system, however much each professes to have advanced beyond Hegel. Their polemics against Hegel and against one another are confined to this, and each extracts one side of the Hegelian system and turns this against the whole system, as well as against the sides extracted by the others. To begin with, they extracted pure, unfalsified Hegelian categories such as substance and self consciousness. Later, they desecrated these categories with more secular names such as species, the unique, man, etc.
So I guess a question I would put to other people in this chat would be like, okay, Marx is saying that the problem is that the young Hegelians are simply, I think he's giving a good picture of what it means to experiment with Hegel's philosophy. Like that's kind of what it comes down to is like the distinctions between like Bauer's flavor of young Hegelianism and maybe Marx's when he was a young Hegelian, like is really going to come down to like what do we want to take from Hegel and what do we want to leave behind, and that's going to give you kind of the little distinct character of each of the young Hegelians kind of attempt to materialize Hegel. But I guess a valid question then is, well, what exactly distinguishes Marx from the others, assuming that Marx is, and I guess this is kind of the controversy that comes up on this server a lot, to what extent was Marx still a Hegelian or not? Like, does it, the fact that he is clearly influenced by Hegel somehow make him a Hegelian? And I mean, what would that mean if that's the case? Like, what does everyone else think about that?
I think it would be, I'm guessing what he's going to do, and from the other works I've read, is that he's going to define Hegelianism in such a way that he's in opposition to it. So it's going to be hard to find that within the text. um, but I think when I look at what makes someone a Hegelian versus a materialist or whatever, a naturalist, I might call Marx, I would just say it's not looking at the world as arising from some kind of like conceptual framework, but rather a like naturalistic one that is not reducible to these kind of explanations.
Yeah, I mean, I would almost look at it in terms of like not what distinguishes Marx from the other young Hegelians in reference to Hegel, but what differentiates his sketch of materialism from the other young Hegelians, like Feuerbach especially.
Oh, I mean, we have to read on for me to answer that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think to give like a very quick summary answer, I think in a modern sense he could be described as a post-Hegelian, someone who's been influenced by Hegel but moved past Hegel, or at least tried to move past Hegel and Hegel's domination in philosophical thought at the time. Because he does seem to be rallying the idea that young Hegelians, even though trying to move past Hegel, are still using Hegel's system, or at least a part of it, as a criticism of the rest. So they haven't necessarily moved past Hegel. They're still within the Hegelian framework. At least that's the way I understand this paragraph.
Yeah, I think that's spot on.
I was gonna say, I mean, I still stand by this too, that I might find Marx's critique of the Hegelians problematic. Because I think you run into this problem with any school of thought, right? Like you could take Hegel and say, like, oh, he's a Kantian, or whatever is between him and Kant. I forget, Fichte, I think, was between them. So then you run into that same kind of problem with any school of thought, or you could call like Kant a Humean or something like that, right? So like when do we cut off like being influenced from someone versus being just a new system?
Yeah, and it's also the question of like what is really being like what are individuals who are making this kind of Marx was a closeted alien arguments, like what are they really trying to sneak in by making accusation? Because I think there is a rhetorical bent to the argument, at least when I've heard it.
All right, let's move on to the next one. Imperial, I think you're up.
Sure. The entire body of German philosophical criticism from Strauss to Stirner is confined to criticism of religious conceptions. The critics started from real religion and actual theology. What religious consciousness and a religious conception really meant was determined variously as they went along. Their advance consisted in subsuming the allegedly dominant metaphysical, political, juridical, moral, and other conceptions such as class of religious or theological conceptions, and similarly in pronouncing political, juridical, and moral consciousness and as religious or theological, and the political, juridical, moral man, in the last resort, as religious. The dominance of religion was taken for granted. Gradually, every dominant relationship was pronounced a religious relationship and transformed into a cult of law, a cult of the state, etc. On all sides, it was the only question of dogmas and belief in dogmas. The world was sanctified to an ever-increasing extent till at last our venerable Saint Max was able to canonize it en bloc and thus dispose of it once and for all.
I think that definitely sheds light on what he views as the distinction, right? So the entire body of German philosophical criticism from Strauss to Stirner is confined to criticism of religious concepts. I mean, I haven't read that entire body. I mean, from what you guys know, is that true?
And I think what's most important is why he thought was a problem, which I kind of alluded to earlier, which is basically, I mean, maybe the most salient problem he saw with it was that by focusing so much on criticizing religion, the problem Marx saw with that is that we're not actually getting to the heart of social criticism. Like he thinks that from the perspective of religious critics, that there's this idea that you're actually doing something that is going to improve the conditions of real people. But Marx doesn't think that's true because he sees religion as a symptom of social problems, not as a cause of, or not principally as a cause of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, do you think, given that kind of analysis, could you level that critique at someone like Nietzsche as well?
I would personally.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
I know
So that's
that's
why-
not it's not a fun idea. It's not popular. So
Right. And then when he says like moral man, juridical man, things like that, he's not necessarily against those concepts, but he's against viewing them through the lens of like religious oriented
Mhm.
language, or being opposed to
Yeah.
them, because you're opposed to religion and not for some other reason.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
he seems to be
Yeah,
critiquing the. Oh, sorry. So I just wanted to say, from like my understanding, he's critiquing the young Hegelians for critiquing the idea of the moral man, the juridical man, as religious concepts. So here he's accusing them of turning every relationship into a religious relationship, and then criticizing it.
Yeah, I think that's what I meant to explain, but you did it much better.
Yeah, no. Sorry.
I was just gonna. Yeah, the only thing I was gonna point out is that, and this is one of the things that I love about Marx. Like, he has like a very, it's kind of like a sense of humor, like his, satirical tone. Like, he's doing this kind of like double satire by giving like this naming convention that we'll see elsewhere in the book too. Giving the name of Saint Max to Max Stirner. He's kind of satirizing, like, as in a way of like holding up a mirror, right? Saying like, okay, you want to focus on everything in terms of religion? All right, then I'm going to bless you with some religiously loaded naming convention, which I just think is like, it's brilliant. A little
for sure.
immature,
I
but
definitely.
I would love to add two comments. So one on the point that you just mentioned, Varsity. Like, it's absolutely true, and I think that actually it's imperative to understanding like anything in his work, because, for example, there's this famous quote in, I think it maybe it's in this work. I don't remember which one it's in, but it's basically Marx saying like, or supposedly Marx saying, "Oh, in communism, we will have like the ability to be in such abundance that you don't have to have one line of work. So you could be a fisher in the morning and then go home and be a critic in the afternoon and all this stuff, right?" And actually, something interesting about that quote is that it was written by Engels, and that actually a critic in the afternoon is something that Marx added to make fun of Engels, because Engels did not understand what Marx was even talking about. So he was like, no, this is kind of silly, like, to think of it as like this like kind of utopian, like, oh, I could just have like a very fluid career where I'm just moving in between things constantly. Like, this is goofy to Marx. And the other comment was that talking about the young Hegelians and how it is that Marx is different from them. So for me, when we read Marx, what we notice is that this picture of man, this like humanist kind of young Hegelianism, is so kind of disdained by Marx, because I think Marx was very captured by it in his younger years. Like, that Marx early on, if you read his early works, like, really is like influenced by this view of the world in this humanist kind of framework. Like, he constantly talks about this idea of species being, and even that's like kind of translating it wrong, because what the term actually is like genus being, which I think makes it a little bit more a comment on our qualitative phenomenological consciousness, rather than just like, like a specific human species that he's talking about. Because I don't think that later on Marx clings to that idea. Like, I think Marx abandons this like humanist kind of picture of the world, like this Hegelian humanism, I don't think that's something that sticks with him for his whole career. And I think that that ability to reflect, to recognize in the past that you were wrong, and to keep restating in what way you were wrong, that is what is really the mark of a critic. Like, that's the mark of somebody who knows himself very well. And that's what distinguishes Marx from the other young Hegelians to me, is that he's actually able to look at his old humanist thoughts and be kind of repulsed by it in a way, thinking, oh, this is why I was wrong about this.
Real
Yeah.
quick, I don't want to linger too long, but I just want to ask you a question. What do you mean by like qualitative consciousness, the genus being versus the species being? Could you just elucidate that real
So
quick?
clearly, looking at like the term species being like, you're trying to say like that it's in having the genetic kind of condition of having like human DNA, being a human, being able to reproduce with humans. When we say the word species, that's usually kind of more a loaded term that means this kind of thing. Genus is like, when we look at different genuses, we're looking at radically different kinds of animals, radically different kinds of creatures. Whereas, with when he's trying to say, denote this idea of like the genus being or the species being or whatever, the original German word is, in the context of the development of his philosophy, I think it would be totally absurd to take it as meaning, that we're talking about like a particular species that we can taxonomically identify. Because I think that something that later Marx is very strong on is the potential of looking, like just considering theoretically speaking, the possibility of differently minded individuals, differently minded things that have what we call phenomenological consciousness. And I think that that's something that is what drives him to abandon this like humanism, is this idea of the structure itself becoming an automaton, and the automaton itself basically subsuming the people within it into its own logic. And this is how some people take him as such a a thinker of like real subsumption and all this. I think that this is maybe something silly to take away from the idea that the automaton is working through us. I think that what he really means is that you give your time to the thing, and that if you're going to do this job, that you have to work according to its logic, right? I think that's the more important point, is that he's saying that it's robbing you of the ability to work according to different logics. Like when you're at work, you're working a particular kind of way, right? That you're told to operate in these and such ways.
Okay, thank you for giving us more insight on that. All right, Varsity, you want to take the next little short paragraph?
Sure. The old Hegelians had comprehended everything as soon as it was reduced to an Hegelian logical category. The young Hegelians criticized everything by attributing it to religious conceptions or by pronouncing it a theological matter. The young Hegelians are in agreement with the old Hegelians in their belief in rule of religion, of concepts, of a universal principle in the existing world. Only the one party attacks this dominion as usurpation, while the other extols it as legitimate. That is scandalous.
Why do you think it's scandalous?
He's just he's just so spicy. This little short paragraph. He's quite literally saying that in opposing religion, so in the particular way that they do, that like it's kind of keeping it alive. I mean, maybe I don't know how appropriate you think this is, but it maybe a way of summarizing it is like this idea of like beating a dead horse, that kind of thing. The only other thing I would point out too is where he talks about pronouncing as theological matters. I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on it, but if anyone's looking for more, another place where Marx talks about distinguishing between like real problems and theological problems, his contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, we also see a similar phrase appear, I think, a couple times in there.
Yeah, I think I want to move on just because we've been dwelling a lot of background information. So, if you guys are okay with that,
Mhm.
I think I'm next. Since the young Hegelians consider conceptions, thoughts, ideas, in fact, all of the products of consciousness to which they attribute an independent existence, as the real chains of men, just as the old Hegelians declared them to be the true bonds of human society, it is evident that the young Hegelians have to fight only against these illusions of consciousness. Since, according to their fantasy, the relationships of men, all their doings, their chains, and their limitations are products of their consciousness, the young Hegelians logically put to men the moral postulate of exchanging their present consciousness for human, critical, or egoistic consciousness, and thus of removing their limitations. This demand to change consciousness amounts to a demand to interpret reality in another way, i.e., to recognize it by means of another interpretation. The young Hegelian ideologists, in spite of their allegedly world-shattering statements, are the staunchest critics. Staunchest conservatives. The most recent of them have found the correct expression for their activity when they declare they are only fighting against phrases. They forget, however, that to these phrases they themselves are only opposing other phrases, and that they are in no way combating the real existing world when they are merely combating the phrases of this world. The only result which this philosophic criticism could achieve were a few, and that thoroughly one-sided elucidations of Christianity from the point of view of religious history. All the rest of their assertions are only further embellishments of their claim to have furnished, in these unimportant elucidations, discoveries of universal importance. All right, that's a big one. So, any ideas? I like this idea of these kind of young Hegelian systems are all based on certain types of consciousness. And so by postulating there being this other consciousness, you kind of they think they're imagining themselves removing the limitations that Hegelianism has around it. But in reality, they're still buying into that same fundamental idea that consciousness is what reality spawns from.
Reminds me of this phrase that Wandering Cause used to use, some of the later stuff you read there, called like frictionless spinning in a void, where you're just playing around with concepts without like mapping them onto the world. And it's sort of like they're just exchanging different equally used without like having the maps actually affect how they interact with the world, and so it's like the map is, that they're using are only like efficacious. They're not efficacious because they don't actually change the lived experience of material in the embodied in the material world. Really, they just filter they just change, just have the same experience and filter the lenses. It kind of reminded me of the discussion we had the other day about meaning. I don't know if you remember that, Varsity or whatever. Especially when they say it's conservatives or whatever. It's like conservative. Then maybe like even these like masking of like that they think if we just change our like I guess our like filter or framework, we're actually changing, our then we actually makes people more complacent with the real source of like the structure, which is actually the physical organization of social relations, rather than the psychological like framework we impose on them, what other people think.
I agree with that. I also want to say that that's a problem that even like not just Stirner but modern egoists like Rand have, or like ANCAPs in general. I feel like they try
I
to
mean,
start.
it's important. Really important to note, though, that for example, like Stirner is absolutely nothing like Ayn Rand, but I still agree.
Just that one specific thing I think is still similar. Like this trying to work from a certain consciousness and map it onto the world without actually doing the one-to-one mapping of what you're talking about, the concept to the like
I
concrete.
mean, like I agree. I think that there's actually something else that Stirner is attempting to do that I think is unrelated to the point. But I totally agree that there is a problem with I guess just kind of talking speculatively about the movement of religion from like different kind of like supposed periods of development from like because this is what Stirner does. Like he talks about like going from the primitive ancient notion of religion to the kind of more contemporaneous notion of religion, and then the death of God and the creation of the religion of man. And he goes through this in this way, and there is a sense in which that's a valid criticism against him. But I would say that I mean, I think the true heart of what he's doing lies elsewhere in his work, kind of more in like his analysis of what Marx mentions, like the unique, right? That is literally like that is Stirner's concept that he uses for talking about such a thing. Like his project hinges on it. He calls it like der Einzig, right, in German. Anyway, yeah.
Sure. Anyone else want to add something? Okay. Imperial, you're up on the next. Oh wait, there's a little sentence I didn't see. I'll read that and then you can read the next one.
Yep.
It has not occurred to any one of these philosophers to inquire into the connection of German philosophy with German reality, the relation of their criticism to their own material surroundings. All right, go ahead,
All right.
Imperial, on that first paragraph.
Sure. So, first premises of materialist method. The premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises from which abstractions can only be made in the imagination. They are the real individuals, their activity, and the material conditions under which they live, both those which they are already existing and those produced by by their activity. These premises can thus be verified in a purely empirical way. Should I go to the next one, or it was quite short?
Yeah, take one more.
The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Thus, the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. Of course, we cannot here go either into the actual physical nature of man or into the natural conditions in which man finds himself, geological, hydrographical, climatic, and so on. The writing of history must always set out from these natural bases and their modifications in the course of history and through the actions of men. Okay, so it sounds like he's setting up a dialectic here between man and nature, the environment in which he's in. And he's implying there's obviously an interaction between these two. So man not only exists in the material conditions, but he also shapes his own material conditions, right? So the two opposites are, in a sense, united into a single whole.
Yeah, I think there's definitely that dialectic going there. I also I highlighted this phrase, both those which they already find existing and those produced by their activity. I was reading the earlier little text that they included, introduction to the critique of political philosophy before this, and he's really big on making that distinction. Production, which is created like in the time, and then kind of like the kind of prior conditions that you're born into that inform the current production. And I think I'm interested to see how he connects that with ideology or like this kind of Hegelian philosophy, right? Because I get how it makes sense in terms of material production, but I wonder how that's going to lead to the actual critique of the young Hegelians. Okay, I'll take the next one. Men can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. They themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life. The way in which men produce their means of subsistence depends, first of all, on the nature of the actual means of subsistence they find in existence and have to reproduce. This mode of production must not be considered simply as being the production of the physical existence of the individuals. Rather, it is a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and how they produce. The nature of individuals thus depends on the material conditions determining their production. Yep. What do we think about that premise? That's a pretty bold stance, right?
Well, I read Levinas a few weeks ago, and I feel like he takes some stuff from this, but he would they could add that like labor is in Levinas' view. He has this perspective that labor is kind of connected to language in a way, because we need to be able to like signify and gesture toward the world in order to give it like a meaning or whatever, and and this way, and he's sort of like maybe I'll talk more about how that might connect to like the production of the organization of labor, but it's just something I thought of, a connection I thought of. Cause I think Levinas probably takes a lot from Marx, even though I don't think that it's this early Marx stuff when he talked about like labor as being like he talks about stuff like labor being uh, the where we take a hold of the future of the once unknown future of nature. But
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like a rejection of human nature as such, right? Like something that you can find and build premises off of and build a philosophical system off of.
I
Kind
don't
of,
even necessarily think I agree. I think what he's referring to when he says men, he obviously refers to human beings, but I think he's also in a particular way trying to focus on what we'd consider humanity, the kind of things that distinguishes us from dogs and birds and stuff. So for him, it appears to me that what he's trying to say is what distinguishes us from these other living creatures is our consciousness, and we only do that as soon as we produce the means of our subsistence, right? So this is why for him the particular way in which we go about achieving those means of subsistence, like humans produce them, right? So the mode of production for him therefore is the thing that shapes human consciousness. So here I think he's setting up this what am I trying to say? He's setting up this condition where I don't know if he's going to go on later on in the book to elaborate more, but for me, it seems like he's trying to set up this idea that we should consider the mode of production as the essential thing that determines the consciousness of men as it is, apart from the consciousness of animals. I don't know. Would you guys agree or disagree?
Uh,
I I don't think that's mutually exclusive from what I was saying, though, because I think by doing that,
Mhm.
you get rid of ideas like this Hobbesian notion of men as like naturally this one way, and so that's why certain political arrangements arise, or
Mhm.
like a Lockean or Rousseauian view where they're like doing these like specific types of interactions because of human nature. I think he's trying to reject that and saying like actually the material conditions are what determines what that human nature is.
Yeah, I guess I should have asked you to clarify what exactly you meant by human nature because, um, yeah, I probably should have asked that first.
What do you think, Wandering? You're gonna jump in.
I was just going to actually say the exact thing that you said because I definitely think that what you guys said was not incommensurate with each other. In fact, I think that Imperial, you actually elucidated through what you said what Nietzsche was trying to say is in that the means producing our own means of subsistence or our own means of material, our own material conditions for Marx is like is the moment where human nature as a conception kind of falls apart because then if it is the material conditions that kind of determine the what's possible or determines like somewhat determines or somewhat has like a causal effect on how we think or on what we conceive as being possible to think then we are at a point where human nature seems much more like fluid, which in that sense it's not even really nature. It's like it's something that is totally caught up in social relations. And I think that sums it up pretty good. What I wanted to say there.
But if it's relations, does it Bradley's regress because blah 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 relations? Sorry, I'm just.
No. We can talk about that another time. But yeah, that's definitely referring to something else. But I know you were just joking.
All right. Yeah, let's try to get moving so that we don't have too long of a recording. I'll read the next part. This production only makes its appearance with the increase of population. In its turn, this presupposes the intercourse of individuals with one another. The form of this intercourse is again determined by production. The relations of different nations among themselves depends upon the extent to which each has developed its productive forces, the division of labor, and internal intercourse. This statement is generally recognized, but not only the relation of one nation to others, but also the whole internal structure of the nation itself depends on the stage of development reached by its production and its internal and external intercourse. How far the productive forces of a nation are developed is shown most manifestly by the degree to which the division of labor has been carried. Each new productive force, insofar as it is not merely a quantitative extension of productive forces already known, for instance, the bringing into cultivation of fresh land, causes a further development of the division of labor. The division of labor inside a nation leads at first to the separation of industrial and commercial from agricultural labor, and hence to the separation of town and country and to the conflict of their interests. A further development leads to the separation of commercial from industrial labor. At the same time, through the division of labor, inside these various branches, there develop various divisions among the individuals cooperating to definite kinds of labor. The relative position of these individual groups is determined by the methods employed in agriculture, industry, and commerce, patriarchalism, slavery, estates, classes. These same conditions are to be seen, given a more developed intercourse, and the relations of different nations to one another.
Was this talking? Was there like a part I missed earlier when they were when Marx was talking about previous historical forms of social organization, or does this, or is it just like a translation thing? Because like nation sort of like presupposes like has like a kind of baggage of the nation state, which I hear is like a more like modern sort of means of socio political organization.
Does talk about that in the introduction to Critique of Political Philosophy, but not in this work. He kind of just
Oh,
jumps right into the nation.
It's kind of like it's used by stuff like this because like I was wondering are they totally doing like is Marx doing a chronological like ordering or is he like just jumping on like from a topic across time or whatever that are like related to some broader point or whatever.
I do believe he talks about it later, but he hasn't mentioned it so far.
Or yeah, I'm just checking because that was like a contention I sort of had.
I
I
don't
was
think he
wondering.
really do a historical critique at this. I think he's talking about modern nations,
I see.
like
Yeah,
developed as from the point of them becoming a nation, not necessarily like a historical like all the nations became nations through this process or something like that. I think he's saying insofar as it is a nation, it goes through these stages. That do you think that's accurate?
yeah. It's there's probably a lot more to talk about there, and than just like the term nation used. Um, but vision of the each develop its product.
I mean, I this is the kind of analysis I start to get more skeptical of because I'm like the kind of like they've been developed. The relations of different nations among themselves depend on the extent to which has developed its productive forces. Like this idea of developing productive forces, division, it starts to get kind of borderline ideal history to me. I don't know if I'm mistaken on that or just misunderstanding, but what do you think,
I
Wandering?
don't think you're mistaken. Like I would say that I am actually just totally not sure what you mean.
Like saying that there's like a certain end that it goes towards the extent like he
I
kind of
guess I would say that he's not saying that. Like I definitely don't think he's saying that.
I see in the other work that the intro to Critique of Political Philosophy, he kind of talks about them being more or less developed and being simpler. And it's I just don't what do you think he means?
I don't think that like when somebody like Marx says I'm not saying just invoking him and saying oh well he can't like use this word in this way. I think that he really does mean something different than what we assume he means when he says simple. Like I don't think he's like trying to say like yeah there's this like there's this type of economy that's savage and then this one that's not. I mean like I think that what he's saying is that according to a European kind of outlook on how economics has developed in the European context, in the context of the division of labor, which is something that he's talking about, not just in reference to his own analysis, but also to the analysis of political economy. I mean, like development of different nations and stuff is something that is really important to Smith, right? Like talking about, okay, how do nations like develop these economies that we see in his day and age, like the late 1700s. How do we get to this point from like feudalism and all that? And it's part of their analysis to talk about the development of these economies into this form. I think that what Marx is meaning is that in this context of what Adam Smith is talking about, that we would encounter through their analysis this talk of like this division of labor. Because I mean if we look actually at what Marx has written about the division of labor specifically, it's not all good, but it's not like he's going to say that the division of labor is something that we should do without or something. He's just going to say that like the division of labor leads to a different context, a different economic context. And I think that's the most important part. If the means of subsistence determine what seems possible to us in a sense, like has any causal connection whatsoever on how we think, then I think it very logically follows that if it has some kind of connection, it's going to have some kind of connection to these other things he's talking about in reference to like development of out for socialism, right? Like he's saying that socialism in the earlier periods of his work, he's saying, oh yeah, it only appears once you have the correct like development of productive forces, but then his work is just the way that we talk about productive forces. Like he does not actually talk about all of this stuff in this way later on. He talks about it in terms of capital itself rather than talking about productive forces and all these things. Because I think that this is something that what his original PhD thesis about, which of just famous writer on Socrates and Epicurus. That's what his doctoral thesis is about. Is kind of dichotomizing those two views, Socrates and Epicurus. That maybe you could say in his earlier works. Okay.
Yeah.
1 second.
Point taken. I will watch out for that. For what you're saying. Let's go to the next part. Sorry. Thank you for answering that though for me. Imperial, you want to take the next paragraph?
Yes. So the various stages of development, is that where we left off? Yep. Yep. The various stages of development and division of labor are just so many different forms of ownership, i.e., the existing state of the division of labor determines also the relations of individuals to one another with reference to the material, instrument, and product of labor. The first form of ownership is tribal, and there's a German word here, ownership. It corresponds to the underdeveloped stage of production at which a people live by the hunting and fishing, by the rearing of beasts in the highest stage, agriculture. It is in the latter case, it presupposes a great mass of uncultivated stretches of land. The division of labor is at this stage still very elementary and is confined to a further extension of the natural division of labor existing in the family. The social structure is, therefore, limited to an extension of family. The patriarchal family chieftains, below them the members of the tribe, and finally slaves. Slavery latent in the family only develops gradually with the increase of population, the growth of wants, and with the extension of external relations, both of war and of banter. The second form is the ancient and communal state ownership, which proceeds especially from the union of several tribes into a city by agreement or by conquest, and which is still accompanied by slavery. Besides communal ownership, we already find movable and later also immovable private property developing, but as an abnormal form subordinate to communal ownership. The citizens hold power over their laboring slaves only in their community, and on this account alone, therefore, they are bound to the form of communal ownership. It is the communal private property which compels the active citizens to remain in this spontaneously derived form of association against their slaves. For this reason, the whole structure of society based on this communal ownership, and with it the power of the people, decays in the same measure as, in particular, immovable private property evolves. The division of labor is already more developed. We already find the antagonism of town and country. Later, the antagonism between these states, which represent town interests, and those which represent country interests. And inside towns themselves, the antagonism between industry and maritime commerce. The class relation between citizens and slaves is now completely developed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just agree that this is a decent, maybe not perfect, but decent, like analysis of imperial analysis of how European rise, but still just skeptical about things like the first form, the second form, the undeveloped stage of production. Like I just don't.
That's because he's explicitly talking about like European development. Like he's not trying to even look at any other localities except for in the European context. And that's actually something that is like the most prominent criticism for early Marx is that he's always talking about just Eurocentric stuff. So yeah, I mean, I would agree that it is kind of low resolution, but I would say that there's definitely a reason for it, and that it becomes a different kind of analysis later on.
So they talk is Marx. I don't think he references the type of like material or production being produced here, but is he alluding to like the movement from nomadism to agriculture of some sort?
I don't
Like
think
this-
so, because Europe was not largely nomadic ever. It was mostly agricultural from the start.
It's a,
Mhm.
but then
So I
like,
think
I think
here,
I've heard
That actually that's the kind of tenuous of a claim in some contexts. Like, if we're talking about, okay, I mean, if you want to take issue with that, I guess that would be like a separate, kind of conversation. But I was just going to say that there are definitely like grounds to say that there was a period of nomadism in Europe. It's just not that it was like like a total kind of sense of like every culture developed that way. It's just that there were some peoples that developed that way, and there were others that developed this agricultural base that you're talking about.
Well, I also think you're talking about like Eastern versus Western and Northern versus Southern Europe, and it just gets tricky, which is why this kind of analysis is, and it's like where we're coming from. And
yeah, for sure. I
Yeah,
think
but I mean, this is 1846, right? This is not like the later period. Usually is cited as like starting like after this work actually. So I would say that maybe it might be worthwhile if like at some point we do in the reading group a reading of I don't know, some other work after this that might
okay, yeah,
talk about that. No, these are here. Give me 1 second.
so for me,
oh, sorry, go on.
I was asking Imperial if you wanted to give his thought real quick while Wandering's doing it.
yeah. So I'll just chime in for 2 seconds. I think the last two paragraphs that I've read, honestly, could just be two books on their own, two history books, and I think there's a reason why they're only two paragraphs, and it's that I think Marx is not particularly interested in describing exactly how every tribe has like coalesced into a nation and all that. He's just giving like a brief overview, and he's like, okay, how do we get to now? I think even if some of the claims in here could potentially be false, they could be false. I think the underlying assumptions of this division of labor as arising from the mode of production would still probably hold. And I think insofar as that is still there, then I think even if this is just inaccurate, rushing through however many thousands of years of history to get to, I presume at this point, at the end of the paragraph, it's like city states are developing and there's already urbanization, so it's at least the Middle Ages.
But probably actually classical, right?
Perhaps, yeah, could also be ancient Rome now that I think about it. But I think initially at the very, very start, when he's talking about the underdeveloped stage of production, I think he's referring to what we would more associate with primitive communism, which I don't want to get into discussion whether it's nomadic or not, but it will be hunter-gatherer, perhaps closer, just before the rise of agriculture. And he did specifically say the rise of agriculture at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to be super critical because I think you're right. It is describe a lot of history, and it's not his main focus in this text. So I think both of you are making really good points. For me, I'm trying to figure out like what kind of argument he's actually making and why we should buy like this particular type of analysis as opposed to another one. I'm just trying to figure out like is he purely just trying to describe things? Is this like inference to best explanation, and this explains like phenomena that we experience better than like a natural rights perspective might, or like whatever an ideal history might, or some other sort of explanation? Or
I brought up the nomadism agriculture thing because I hear like one theory I think I heard once from like a friend who was like in the history that like one of the causes of like that immovable movability thing that Marx talks about in this paragraph was like they were dependence on like stuff like I guess crop rotation and stuff. So you had instead of like traversing through the lands to
Mhm.
find food, you consolidate your community around a particular like crop and stuff. So it's kind of like why I think here it's sort of like
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
agriculture
I
was
also go
developed at
ahead.
one point. Agriculture was developed at one point. We didn't always farm stuff. There was a time in which we developed it. So there was a time before agriculture. So I think obviously there was a time when we did hunting and fishing. Um,
Yeah, but that
yeah,
wasn't necessarily nomadic, I guess is the point. Like
yeah, it
nomadism.
wouldn't be nomadic.
I think that this is that like I mean like look at I think that a lot of what you're saying, Nietzsche, is totally true, and that is the exact reason that later on we see like I don't know what I guess I would refer to as more like a pluralistic analysis of different societies in Marx. Like his later works, but right before he died, all of his notebooks are about different societies like India and China and all these places that in his earlier analysis he didn't really kind of go into very seriously. And I think that that is something worth noting. Maybe it doesn't abscond him of the criticisms that you're making at all. I'm just saying that we're not looking at like the complete total system at all here. We're just looking at kind of the sketchings of what is to be, and also there are some I don't know, like strange things going on with the like historiographical, like some ecology editions were heavily kind of I don't know, edited by not just Engels, but also like that we were talking about this like mega thing, this like revival of like Marx and Engels writings in this collection of like 100 volumes. And it was initially started by one of the Soviet institutes for protecting Marx's works. And it was around like 1950s that this started. So there was a push to kind of see Marx as saying that we have to look at these material productive forces and the development of them as this like very very important point, because we need to highlight how the Soviet Union is the achievement of all of this, right? And that this is where the productive forces are being developed today. And I think that there's something worth noting about that. Obviously, like it could not be true in this context, but I think it's worth looking into for sure.
Yeah, totally. It does smack a little of scientific socialism esque stuff too. So it could be Engels' hand as well. Do you? I think Imperial, you're going to read the next one.
Sure. With the development of private property, we find here for the first time the same conditions which we shall find again, only a more extensive scale, with modern private property. On the other hand, the concentration of private property, which began very early in Rome, as the Licinian agrarian law proves, and proceeded very rapidly from the time of the civil wars and especially under the emperors. On the other hand, coupled with this, the transformation of the plebeian small peasantry into a proletariat, which, however, owing to its intermediate position between the propertied citizens and slaves, never achieved an independent development. The third form of ownership is feudal or estate property. If antiquity started out from town and its little territory, the Middle Ages started out from the country. This differing starting point was determined by the sparseness of the population at the time, which was scattered over a large area which received no large increase from the conquerors. In contrast to Greece and Rome, feudal development at the outset, therefore, extends over a much wider territory, prepared by the Roman conquest and the spread of agriculture at first associated with it. The last centuries of the declining Roman Empire and its conquest by the barbarians destroyed a number of productive forces. Agriculture had declined, industry had decayed for want of a market, trade had died out or has been violently suppressed, rural and urban populations have decreased. From these conditions and the mode of organization of the conquest determined by them, Feudal property developed under the influence of the Germanic military constitution. Like the tribal and communal ownership, it is based again on community, but the directly producing class is standing over against it is not, as in the case of the ancient community, the slaves, but the unserved small peasantry. As soon as feudalism is fully developed, there also arises antagonism to the towns. The hierarchical structure of land ownership and the armed bodies of retainers associated with it gave the nobility power over the serfs. The feudal organization was, just as much as the ancient communal ownership, an association against a subjected producing class, but the form of association and the relation to the direct producers was different because of the different conditions of production. The feudal system of land ownership had its counterpart in towns in the shape of corporative property, the feudal organization of trades. Here, property consisted chiefly in the labor of each individual person. The necessity for association against the organized robber nobility, the need for communal covered markets in an age when the industrialist was at the time a merchant, the growing competition of the escaped serfs swarming into the rising towns, the feudal structure of the whole country, these combined to bring about the guilds. The gradually accumulated small capital of individual craftsmen and their stable numbers, as against the growing population, evolved the relation of journeyman and apprentice, which brought into being in the towns a small hierarchy similar to that in the country. Should I keep going, or
Let's pause there briefly. Anything stand out to you? I think.
If anybody else doesn't have, oh, go ahead, Nisha. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I do like his analysis of feudal society a lot better, but maybe it's because it's more.
Yes, because it's explicitly Western in its context, so he has an easier time talking about it, I think.
Yeah.
I definitely don't think he has the acumen at this time period, like 1846, to talk about India or China or even like Central Asia or Russia. I think that those places like are really, I mean, you can look at some of the like latest works that Marx is doing is actually defending the guys in Russia that were claiming that they could like, you know, jump from this like agricultural / like feudal kind of society straight to like a socialist one. He's actually kind of talking to them in letters, telling them, yeah, I like have like you have my full support, and I'm gonna help you out and trying to figure out how you would do that. And I think that, you know, it's interesting to see how more more robust his analysis is in the context of just Western society in his earlier works, and then how it develops, you know, and expands as he gets older. The other thing on this point was, I think it's actually kind of interesting that he's talking about corporations in the context of guilds, because if we look at what like a lot of unsavory kinds of economic theories like you know advocate for, like in the case of like Italy, there was a period of time where this idea of like the syndicate, or like even in France too, like, you know, with Primo de Rivera, you have like this idea of the like the return of the guilds. And I think that that's really this national socialist or national syndicalist attitude is a return to, or like a reactionary kind of revival of the guild kind of model of society. And I think that a lot of people who are of that variety would actually tell you that. I think they would be pretty transparent about it.
Mm-hmm. Just one comment on like the Western focus. I do want to remind that the book is called The German Ideology. I think he's specifically referring to a Western development precisely because he's trying to give context to German school of thought. So he do recall that at the start he's talking about Hegelians and this revolution of thought that was going on in Germany at the time. So I think it's perfectly consistent that he's at the very least talking about development that would have happened more or less in Germany up until that point.
Right. Well, and as far as I know from my reading, Germany was one of the most feudalized country of all of them. It was the most decentralized.
Yeah, I'm actually You know what, Nietzsche? That actually reminds me. I mean, if we're looking at Germanic tribes, I mean, that, especially in that context, I would argue there was a nomadic period. And so I think that, the analysis of that from that perspective, like, is actually pretty salient. Like, if we're not looking at the Roman context, then I think that the previous analysis, if it's just applying to Germany, kind of works.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was very astute of Imperial to kind of catch that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Anything else, or should I just continue? There's 2 more paragraphs, and then there's the next section. So
I actually think, I think
Mhm.
you should just go for it, because if we're trying to limit it to 2 hours, then yeah, definitely, I would say just go to the end.
Yeah.
Okay. Does
You
the
want me-
chief form of yes, sir? Do you want me to go?
I was gonna say if you want me to jump in, just stop and I'll do it.
Sure. If you want to take over. No mind.
Okay, I'll do the next one, then you can finish
Mhm.
off. All right.
Mhm.
Thus, the chief form of property during the feudal epoch consisted, on the one hand, of landed property with serf labor chained to it, and on the other hand, of labor of the individual with small capital commanding the labor of journeymen. The organization of both was determined by the restricted conditions of production, the small scale and primitive cultivation of the land, and the craft type of industry. There was little division of labor in the heyday of feudalism. Each country bore in itself the antithesis of town and country. The division into estates was certainly strongly marked, but apart from the differentiation of princes, nobility, clergy, and peasants in the country, and masters, journeymen, apprentices, and soon also the rabble of casual laborers in the town, no division of importance took place. In agriculture, it was rendered difficult by the strip system, besides which the cottage industry of peasants themselves emerged. In industry, there was no division of labor at all in the individual trades themselves, and very little between them. The separation of industry and commerce was found already in existence in older towns. In the newer, it only developed later, when the towns entered into mutual relations. The grouping of larger territories into feudal kingdoms was a necessity for the landed nobility as for the towns. The organization of the ruling class, the nobility, had therefore everywhere a monarch at its head. The fact is, therefore, that definite individuals who are productively active in a definite way enter into these definite social and political relations. Empirical observation must, in each separate instance, bring out empirically, and without any mystification and speculation, the connection of the social and political structure with production. The social structure and the state are continually evolving out of the life process of definite individuals, but of individuals not as they appear in their own or other people's imagination, but as they really are, i.e., as they operate, produce materially, and hence as they work under definite material limits, presuppositions, conditions independent of their will. All right, jump in, Imperial.
Trying to get someone to read.
Oh, yeah. You want to read, Josh?
I haven't read it yet, so I guess I'll read. How far you want me to read to?
Just read this paragraph. We'll see how far we get.
The production of ideas, of conceptions, of consciousness is at first directly interwoven with the material activity and the material intercourse of men, the language of real life. Conceiving, thinking, and mental intercourse of men appear at this stage as the direct efflux, never seen that word before, of their material behavior. The same applies to mental production as expressed in the language of politics, laws, morality, religion, metaphysics, etc. of a people. When men are the producers of their conceptions, ideas, etc., real active men, as they are conditioned by a definite development of their productive forces and of the intercourse corresponding to these up to its furthest forms. Consciousness can never be anything else than conscious existence, and the existence of men is their actual life process. If in all ideology men are and their circumstances appear upside down, as in a camera obscura, this phenomena arises just as much from their historical life process as the inversion of objects of their retina does from their physical life process. Want me to keep going or no?
I do want to apologize. I was reading a paragraph while I was on mute, so that's why no sound came up.
You get Josh.
Yeah,
you read
did you
one
want
more.
to finish up Imperial, because I think that you'd wanted to read originally, right?
Yeah,
I don't mind. I don't mind.
yeah. We
So
only
I can
have
take
3 paragraphs left, so why don't we each read one?
Sure. Okay, so I'll go with the first one. In direct contrast to German philosophy, which descends from heaven to earth, here we ascend from earth to heaven. That is to say, we do not set out from what men say, imagine, conceive, nor from men as narrated, thought of, imagine, conceive, in order to arrive at men in flesh. We set out from real, active men, and on the basis of the real life process, we demonstrate the development of the ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. The phantoms formed in the human brain are also necessary sublimits of their material life process, which is empirically verifiable and bound to material premises. Morality, religion, metaphysics, all rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness thus no longer retain the semblance of independence. They have no history, no development, but men, developing their material production and their material intercourse, alter along with this their real existence, their thinking, and the products of their thinking. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. It is the first method of approach. The starting point is consciousness taken as living individual. In the second method, which conforms to real life, it is the real living individuals themselves and consciousness is considered solely as their consciousness.
Okay, I'll do the next one. Then Josh, you take the last one. This method of approach is not devoid of premises. It starts out from the real premises and does not abandon them for a moment. Its premises are men, not in any fantastic isolation and rigidity, but in their actual empirically perceptible process of development under definite conditions. As soon as this active life process is described, history ceases to be a collection of dead facts, as it is with the empiricists, themselves still abstract, or an imagined activity of imagined subjects, as with the idealists. All right, Josh, go ahead.
Speculation ends. In real life, their real positive science begins. The representation of the practical activity, of the practical process of development of men. Empty talk about consciousness ceases, and real knowledge has to take its place. When reality is depicted, philosophy as an independent branch of knowledge loses its medium of existence. At the best, its place can only be taken by a summing up of the most general results. Abstractions which arise from the observation of the historical development of men. Viewed apart from real history, these abstractions have in themselves no value whatsoever. They can only serve to facilitate the arrangement of historical material, indicate the sequence of its separate strata, but they by no means afford recipe or schema, as does philosophy, for neatly trimming the epochs of history. On the contrary, our difficulties begin only when we set about the observation and the arrangement, the real depiction of our historical material, whether of a past epoch or a present. The removal of these difficulties is governed by premises which it is quite impossible to state here, but which will only study of the actual life process and the activity of the individual of each epoch will make evident. We shall select here some of these abstractions, which we use in contradistinction to the ideologist, and shall illustrate them by historical examples.
Okay, cool. We'll stop there. We got 8 minutes, so we can just discuss that large section we just went over. Which honestly, I feel like that was kind of the meat of it, right? Like that was the interesting part.
Absolutely. I think almost to a degree, the history that Marx was describing just above is just kind of giving context. It's kind of like the salad on the side. The actual meat of the discussion does appear to be here, and he does seem to state it in quite strong language, which we could definitely See,
I think I go back to I don't know what kind of argument he's making. Like I feel like he's making a really strong and consistent hypothesis that is really able to elucidate history, but I just don't know if it's because like this claim, the production of ideas of conceptions of consciousness is at first directly interwoven with the material activity and material intercourse of men, the language of real life. It's an efflux of their material behavior. I don't know about that. That seems like a very
Uh,
strong.
I think that that's because he's talking in the words of somebody like Democritus or Epicurus. Like I think that he's talking in some sense about like a materialist, in his earlier work, kind of the sense of materialism of this like underlying conditions, like almost like a Freudian, like an unconscious part of reality that determines conscious life. And uh, ends from short just written in. But that's my opinion on it. And I think that there's definitely like it, and that I don't know. Maybe we could recapitulate something from. I think that the kind of idea of critique that it develops in his work is much more interesting.
Oh, I think the critique itself is interesting, and I think I don't even mind like a large book of theory. I just also wonder what methods would we use to prove this, or like what methods would we use to like choose over another system? Like what would make this the best explanation? Like what would be our criteria for judging that?
He is I think he's trying to do something, and this might be, like partially like a statement of my own, bias about what is going on here. But I think when he's talking about like the start of real knowledge that's based off of like real like things and stuff, that there's something of a trajectory that is taken up by future thinkers that are talking about elucidating like the concepts that we're talking about. And I think that that's because he is an inheritor of a German idealist kind of notion of critique, and that he is going to be kind of not developing his own kind of way of critique until much later. And that this, I mean, look at Marx, who's deeply influenced by some notion of like German idealism to a large degree. And I think it's worth noting for this section especially that when he's talking about like these underlying material conditions, there is like some kind of like Kantian element of like this underlying noumena that's moving that we need to aim ourselves towards, instead of this like abstraction that these other young Hegelians and old Hegelians are like playing around with. So I don't know. I think that's just kind of my schematization of it, and it could totally be like me just reading in too much to it.
Oh, fair enough. I mean, I think there's lots of reasons to read this and appreciate it, even if you don't necessarily buy into all of the premises either. So I don't want anyone to think that for the most part, I feel like I would agree with, especially maybe not this part though, the materialism part. And I feel like I agree with you later on. He gets away from some of that, kind of like what he would call vulgar materialism. So I don't know. Josh, you have any thoughts before we sign off, or Imperial?
I don't know. Reading it makes it hard to remember.
Fair enough. Imperial.
I think at the very end here, he is laying the groundwork, obviously, for what he's going to say next. I think, in a sense, he's trying to. Like, I do agree with what you're saying that a lot of it is like it's a very strong hypothesis to make, and it does seem like he is taking a big gamble here because it's if you knock it down, it does appear that this will like fatally weaken his method to the point where it'll be difficult to extract anything of value from it. Well, perhaps maybe not like that. But at least here, he is still caught up in this dialectic with the young Hegelians, I think, where he's trying to state his position as being firmly rooted in the real material man and not some abstract conception of it. And he does even state that, just to recap, that it is men who create what's the morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest. No, hold on, that's not it. That's not what they create. Oh, the same applies to mental. Men are the producers of their conceptions, ideas. So what he's saying here is that, of course, the material precedes the ideal. I'm not sure. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Sure, I'm gonna end the recording, then I'll give you my thoughts. 1 second.
Mhm.